The fluorescent lights in the CIA archive room hummed like trapped insects. Robert Chen rubbed his eyes, staring at the grainy photograph for the third time that November morning in 1985. Dear viewers, my big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you subscribe, I'll keep creating even more fascinating and unique videos about the Cold War between the US and the USSR. And with your support, we'll get closer to that goal. I'm truly grateful to everyone who's helped me along the way. Now let's move into today's story. The image showed 12 men standing in front of a concrete building, faces pale in the Soviet winter. One man, third from the left, caught Chen's attention. Sharp cheekbones, narrow eyes, a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. Something about that face triggered a memory buried deep in Chen's mind. He pulled another file from the stack, immigration records from 1970. His fingers moved faster now, flipping through pages of arrival documents. There. David Walsh, translator, arrived at Dulles Airport on March 15, 1970. The photograph paper-clipped to the visa application showed the same face. Same scar, same eyes. Chen's pulse hammered in his temples. He cross-referenced the Moscow photograph's date stamp, February 1968. The building in the background was unmistakable to anyone trained in Soviet intelligence architecture, the Red Banner Institute, KGB training facility. David Walsh had been living in suburban Maryland for 15 years. He worked at the State Department. He had a wife named Margaret, 2 children, a mortgage on a 3-bedroom house. Chen had processed his security clearance renewal just 8 months earlier without a second thought. The coffee in Chen's mug had gone cold. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the secure telephone. This wasn't a routine discovery. This was a Soviet sleeper agent embedded in the American government, undetected for over a decade. The man translated sensitive diplomatic cables. He had access to classified communications. He attended meetings where policy was debated and secrets were shared. Chen dialed his supervisor's extension. 3 rings, 4. The weight of what he'd uncovered pressed against his chest like a physical force. Somewhere in Maryland, a man was drinking his morning coffee, kissing his wife goodbye, preparing for another ordinary day. He had no idea the walls were about to collapse. The line clicked. Chen inhaled deeply. Everything was about to change. David Walsh's alarm clock buzzed at 6:15 every morning. The sound mixed with birdsong filtering through curtains that Margaret had sewn herself. He rose, showered, dressed in one of his 4 rotating ties. Today's was blue with thin gray stripes. The kitchen smelled of brewing coffee and toast. Margaret packed lunches while Susan argued with Tom about whose turn it was to feed their dog. David kissed his wife's cheek, tasted the mint of her toothpaste. Normal. Perfectly unremarkably normal. His commute took 32 minutes on the metro. He read the Washington Post, occasionally glancing at other passengers, lawyers, secretaries, lobbyists, all absorbed in their own routines. Nobody looked twice at the quiet man in the gray suit. The State Department building swallowed him into its bureaucratic maze. His office on the 4th floor held a metal desk, filing cabinets, a small window overlooking the parking lot. Translation work arrived in manila folders throughout the day. Soviet diplomatic correspondence, trade documents, cultural exchange proposals. David's Russian was flawless. His supervisors praised his nuanced understanding of idioms and context. At lunch, he ate sandwiches in the cafeteria with other translators. They discussed baseball scores and weekend plans. David mentioned Tom's upcoming Little League game. Someone complained about mortgage rates. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in sterile brightness. 15 years of this. 15 years of mediocrity carefully maintained. His performance reviews were consistently satisfactory, never exceptional enough to draw attention, never poor enough to raise concerns. He had mastered the art of invisibility. Evenings followed predictable patterns. Dinner at 6:30, help with homework, watch the news with Margaret while she graded papers. Their house on Maple Street looked identical to every other house on the block. White siding, black shutters, a maple tree in the front yard that shed leaves every October. Weekends meant yard work and soccer games. David coached Tom's team, teaching boys to kick and pass and work together. Other fathers clapped him on the shoulder, invited him to backyard barbecues. He attended with a six-pack of beer and stayed exactly long enough to seem friendly without being intrusive. The cover story was seamless. Born in Brooklyn to Russian immigrant parents who died when he was young. Raised by an aunt in Brighton Beach. Attended City College. Moved to Washington for work. Every detail memorized, every answer prepared. He had lived this lie so long it had become truth. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man approaching middle age. Gray touched his temples. Lines creased the corners of his eyes. David Walsh was real. The accent was natural. The mannerisms were genuine. But in a locked box hidden behind insulation in the attic, a one-time pad waited in darkness. And somewhere in Moscow, a file labeled Viktor Fedorov, active, gathered dust in a vault 3 stories underground. Leningrad, 1962. Viktor Fedorov was 19 when the 2 men in dark coats appeared at his university dormitory. They showed credentials identifying them as state security officers. Their faces were expressionless masks that revealed nothing. The recruitment happened in a windowless room that smelled of cigarette smoke and floor wax. Victor's linguistic scores had caught someone's attention, perfect marks in English, German, and French. His political reliability was documented across 3 generations. His father had died defending Stalingrad. Training began 3 weeks later. The Red Banner Institute sat behind concrete walls 30 kilometers outside Moscow. Snow covered everything for half the year. Victor learned to strip and reassemble weapons while reciting American state capitals. He memorized baseball statistics from the 1940s and 1950s, absorbed the plot of every popular television show, studied photographs of Brooklyn streets until he could navigate them blindfolded. The instructors were former field operatives, men who had survived decades of espionage work. They broke down Victor's Russian speech patterns and rebuilt them with a Brooklyn accent. He learned to think in English first, translating back to Russian only when necessary. His dreams shifted languages. They created David Walsh from nothing. Forged birth certificate dated April 3, 1945. Fabricated school records from PS 253 in Brighton Beach. A dead aunt named Helen who supposedly raised him after his parents died in a car accident in 1963. Every document was aged, weathered, backstopped through networks of collaborators who planted records in municipal archives. Victor practiced his cover story until it flowed without hesitation. He could describe Helen's apartment, the cracked linoleum in the kitchen, the smell of cabbage cooking, the sound of the elevated train rumbling past. He had never been to Brooklyn. The apartment existed only in carefully constructed memory. 6 years of preparation. 6 years of transformation so complete that Victor began forgetting his real childhood. The instructors considered this ideal. The best legends were those the operative believed themselves. In 1968, final evaluations determined his readiness. Victor, now David in every measurable way, received his assignment. Infiltrate the United States, establish legitimate employment, build a cover life, remain dormant until activated. Time frame, indefinite. Expected duration, decades. The handler who briefed him emphasized patience. This was long-term penetration, not flashy espionage. David would become invisible, ordinary, forgettable. His value lay in access and longevity. March 1970. David Walsh stepped off a plane at Dulles Airport carrying a single suitcase. Immigration officers barely glanced at his documents. His English was flawless, accent perfectly Brooklyn-tinged. He had $3,000 in cash and a letter of recommendation for a translator position at the State Department. Viktor Fedorov had ceased to exist. The man who walked through customs was David Walsh, American citizen, returning home after 2 years teaching English in Europe. The cover story rolled off his tongue like truth. Nobody suspected. Nobody questioned. Nobody looked twice at the quiet young man with the translator's credentials and the forgettable face. The infiltration was complete. The first dead drop location was a hollowed-out brick in a Georgetown alley wall. David found it on a Tuesday evening in October 1972, marked with chalk as his handler had instructed. Inside the cavity, wrapped in waterproof plastic, lay instructions encoded with a one-time pad system. His assignment was simple: observe and remember. No stolen documents, no photographed files. Memory was safer than evidence. David translated diplomatic cables discussing Soviet trade negotiations, arms control proposals, internal debates about détente policy. Each evening, he reconstructed conversations overheard in State Department hallways, meetings where officials spoke freely around the trusted translator. The encoding process happened after midnight, when Margaret slept. David retrieved the one-time pad from its hiding place, a hollowed encyclopedia volume labeled World Geography MN that nobody ever touched. Numbers converted to letters. Letters became seemingly random sequences. He burned each completed pad sheet in the kitchen sink, washing ashes down the drain. Dead drops occurred every 6 to 8 weeks. A chalk mark on a mailbox near DuPont Circle meant pickup in 48 hours. David would leave encoded messages in a magnetic container beneath a park bench in Alexandria or tucked inside a specific volume at the public library. His handler, operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy, retrieved them without ever making direct contact. The intelligence was valuable but not explosive. Moscow received detailed analyses of American negotiating positions during SALT talks. David reported on personnel conflicts within the State Department, identifying officials susceptible to recruitment. He described security procedures, vacation schedules, which doors were left unlocked after hours. His tradecraft was immaculate. He varied his routes home, never establishing predictable patterns. He maintained his cover life with religious consistency: the devoted husband, the engaged father, the reliable colleague. Margaret never noticed the occasional nights when he claimed insomnia and worked in his study until dawn. Years accumulated without incident. The Cold War intensified and relaxed in cycles. Presidents changed, administrations shifted. David remained constant, dependable, utterly unremarkable. Moscow's center considered him a triumph of patient intelligence work, an asset preserved for the long game. But preservation required silence. Between 1975 and 1983, David received no contact from his handlers. The dead drop locations remained empty. No chalk marks appeared. The directive was clear: remain dormant, maintain cover, wait for reactivation. During those silent years, something unexpected happened. David began feeling genuine affection for the life he had built. He attended Susan's school plays and felt pride swelling in his chest. He taught Tom to ride a bicycle and experienced real joy. Margaret's laughter became something he looked forward to rather than merely tolerated. The training had prepared him for everything except this: the possibility that the cover life might become more real than the mission underneath. Viktor Fedorov was a ghost, a memory fading with each passing year. David Walsh was solid, present, alive. In 1984, the chalk marks resumed. Moscow was reactivating assets across American intelligence infrastructure. New instructions arrived: increase reporting frequency, focus on Reagan administration's strategic defense initiatives. David complied. Duty pulled him back. But now, for the first time in his operational life, he hesitated before encoding each message. The conflict was beginning. November 18th, 1985. Special Agent Laura Martinez sat in an unmarked sedan 3 houses down from the Walsh residence. Dawn light filtered through bare tree branches, casting skeletal shadows across suburban lawns. The FBI had opened Operation Silent Grove 6 days earlier, immediately after Robert Chen's discovery. Martinez led a team of 12 agents tasked with determining whether David Walsh was active or dormant. The distinction mattered. Active espionage meant immediate arrest, while a dormant asset might be monitored for months to identify his network. Surveillance teams rotated every 8 hours. They photographed everyone David encountered: colleagues, neighbors, the mailman, the dry cleaner. A magnetic tracking beacon attached to his car's undercarriage transmitted his location every 30 seconds. Phone taps recorded every incoming and outgoing call from the Walsh home. Martinez reviewed David's background file for the 100th time. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Birth certificate from Brooklyn. Legitimate, but the issuing office had burned down in 1978, destroying original records. Childhood school attendance, verified through yearbooks that could be planted. Dead Aunt Helen, cremated in 1969. No living relatives to contradict the story. The FBI contacted the NYPD. No officers remembered the supposed 1963 car accident that killed David's parents. Hospital records from that year showed no John and Marie Walsh admitted for trauma. The story was a ghost built on ghosts. Agents sifted through the Walsh family's garbage every Tuesday morning. Newspapers, food scraps, children's homework, utility bills. Nothing incriminating. No coded messages, no hidden communications. Either David had stopped operating or his tradecraft was exceptional. Weeks passed. David maintained his routine with mechanical precision. Morning commute, 8 hours at state. Evening return. Grocery shopping on Thursdays. Church on occasional Sundays. Little League practice on Saturdays. The pattern never varied. Martinez grew frustrated. Surveillance consumed resources. Her superiors wanted results. But arresting David without evidence of active espionage risked legal complications. The Moscow photograph proved training, not treason. Immigration fraud was prosecutable, but Moscow would claim David was simply a Soviet citizen who overstayed a visa decades ago. They needed to catch him in the act. December brought freezing rain that made surveillance miserable. Martinez sat in cars that smelled of cold coffee and stale fast food, watching a man live an ordinary life. She began doubting Chen's analysis. Maybe David had defected internally, chosen his American family over Soviet handlers. Maybe 15 years had transformed him. Then, on January 7, 1986, everything changed. Agent Thompson radioed from his position near the bus stop. 3 chalk marks had appeared overnight on a telephone pole, 2 vertical, 1 horizontal. The pattern matched no municipal marking system. Thompson photographed them from multiple angles. Martinez felt adrenaline surge through her exhaustion. This was it, an activation signal. David walked past the pole at 7:22 a.m. His stride didn't break. His expression didn't change. But his right hand brushed against his coat pocket in a gesture that lasted less than a second. Recognition, acknowledgement, confirmation. The dormant asset had just woken up. Moscow was recalling him, and David Walsh knew his time was ending. The question was whether he would run or whether he would stay. Martinez reached for her radio. Surveillance teams needed to tighten. Every movement David made now would be critical. David's hands trembled on the steering wheel. The chalk marks burned in his mind, 3 simple lines that destroyed everything. Emergency protocol, exposure imminent, exfiltration authorized. He drove to work mechanically, translated documents without absorbing their meaning. His supervisor asked if he felt well. David blamed a cold coming on. The lie tasted like ash. Moscow knew. Somehow the Americans had identified him. The chalk marks meant he had 48 hours maximum before arrest. A safe house location memorized 15 years ago pulsed in his thoughts. A storage facility in Baltimore, Unit 247, combination lock 18 to 3409. That evening, David told Margaret he needed to visit a colleague hospitalized across town. She kissed his cheek, reminded him to drive carefully on the icy roads. Tom asked him to bring back ice cream. Susan barely looked up from her homework. The storage facility smelled of concrete dust and motor oil. Unit 247 contained a metal footlocker covered in dust. Inside, $50,000 in 20s and 50s, a Canadian passport under the name Michael Brennan with David's photograph, a loaded Beretta 9mm he had never wanted to touch, maps marked with safe routes to the Canadian border. Instructions typed on yellowing paper outlined the exfiltration plan. Drive to Buffalo. Cross at the Peace Bridge using the Canadian passport. Contact the Soviet consulate in Toronto using a specific recognition phrase. Disappear into the diplomatic machinery that would spirit him back to Moscow. David sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, passport in hand. Michael Brennan's face looked back at him. Same features, different name, another lie. The gun felt heavy and foreign when he picked it up. Going meant never seeing his family again. Margaret would wake tomorrow to find him gone. Susan and Tom would grow up knowing their father was a Soviet spy who abandoned them. The life they had built together, 15 years of accumulated moments, memories, love, would be revealed as an elaborate deception. But staying meant prison, decades behind bars. His children would still know the truth, but he would watch their lives from behind glass during supervised visits, if they came at all. Margaret would divorce him, remarry, erase him from their history. He drove home at midnight. The house was dark except for the porch light Margaret always left burning. Through the living room window he could see their Christmas tree. They had left it up too long, needles browning, but nobody wanted to take it down. David sat in his car with the engine running. Condensation fogged the windows. Inside that house were 3 people who loved David Walsh. They knew nothing of Viktor Fedorov. Their love was real, even if his identity was false. Moscow demanded loyalty. America would demand justice. His family deserved neither burden. At 2:17 a.m., David made his decision. He would pack the car before dawn, tell Margaret he had an emergency work trip. He would drive north, cross the border, disappear. It was cowardice dressed as duty, but it was the only path that avoided dragging his family through public trial and media spectacle. He started the engine, ready to return to the storage unit for the emergency cash. Then the bedroom light flickered on. Margaret appeared at the window, confused, looking for his car. She waved, gesturing for him to come inside. David turned off the ignition. Tomorrow, he decided. One more night. January 9th, 1986. David woke at 5:30 a.m., earlier than his alarm. Margaret slept beside him, breathing softly. He had delayed too long. Today he would run. He dressed in the bathroom, hands steadier than expected. Downstairs, he brewed coffee and packed a travel bag with clothes, toiletries, the emergency cash from the storage unit. His movements were quiet, practiced. At 6:40 a.m., he carried the bag to his car. Frost covered the windshield in crystalline patterns. His breath formed white clouds in the cold air. He opened the trunk, placed the bag inside. Black SUVs materialized from both ends of the street simultaneously. Doors opened. Men in FBI windbreakers emerged with weapons drawn. The nearest neighbor's dog started barking. Martinez walked up the driveway, badge held high in her left hand. Her right hand rested on her holstered weapon. "David Walsh, you're under arrest for espionage against the United States." The words seemed to come from very far away. David's hands rose slowly, palms open. The cold air burned his lungs. "Your real name is Viktor Fedorov. You are a Soviet intelligence officer operating illegally on American soil." Metal handcuffs closed around his wrists with a double click. Miranda rights followed, words David had heard in dozens of television shows but never imagined hearing applied to himself. The front door burst open. Margaret stood in her bathrobe, face blank with incomprehension. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged. An agent positioned himself between her and David. Upstairs, curtains parted. Susan's face appeared in one window, Tom's in another. Both children stared down at their father in handcuffs, surrounded by federal agents. The scene would burn itself into their memories forever. Neighbors emerged onto porches in pajamas and robes. Mrs. Henderson from next door pressed her hand to her mouth. Mr. Patterson held his phone up, filming. An agent searched David's car, found the travel bag, inventoried its contents aloud for the record. Cash, fake passport, loaded firearm. Each item sealed David's fate more completely. Martinez photographed him against the side of the FBI vehicle, front, profile, back. The camera flash was sharp and bright in the gray dawn. Evidence for trial. "Do you understand these rights as I have explained them?" David nodded. His voice came out hoarse. "I want an attorney." They placed him in the back seat. Through the window, he watched Margaret collapse onto the frozen lawn. A neighbor rushed to help her. Susan and Tom had disappeared from the windows. The vehicle pulled away at 6:58 a.m. David twisted in his seat, watching his house recede through the rear window. 15 years of careful construction demolished in 18 minutes. Margaret would learn the truth today. His children would see their father on evening news broadcasts, labeled traitor and spy. Every memory they shared would be re-examined, reinterpreted, poisoned by the revelation of who he really was. The man named David Walsh had lived for 15 years. Viktor Fedorov had destroyed him in less than 20 minutes. Martinez sat in the front passenger seat. She turned to look at him, her expression neither triumphant nor sympathetic, just professional. "Long game's over," she said quietly. David said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The FBI interrogation room was windowless and fluorescent bright. Gray walls, metal table, chairs bolted to the floor. The temperature was kept deliberately cold, a tactic designed to wear down resistance. David sat across from rotating teams of interrogators. They worked in pairs, shifting every 4 hours. Fresh agents against an increasingly exhausted prisoner. Sleep deprivation was subtle but effective. They presented the evidence methodically. The Moscow photograph from 1968, blown up to poster size, mounted on the wall where David couldn't avoid seeing it. Immigration records with inconsistencies highlighted in yellow. The forged Canadian passport found in his car. Encoded messages recovered from dead drop sites after months of surveillance. His attorney, a public defender named Richard Moss, advised silence. David followed the advice, responding to questions with a single phrase, "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." But silence couldn't stop the evidence from accumulating. FBI cryptographers had broken his encoding system using the one-time pad recovered from his house. Messages dating back to 1972 were decrypted, revealing years of intelligence transmission, personnel movements, policy discussions, security procedures, strategic assessments. The intelligence wasn't spectacular, no nuclear secrets, no war plans, but volume mattered. 15 years of steady reporting had given Moscow a detailed understanding of American diplomatic operations. Outside the interrogation room, David's life was being dismantled. Margaret filed for divorce through an attorney. She refused all communication, sent papers through legal channels. Her statement to FBI investigators was brief. She knew nothing, suspected nothing, wanted nothing except to protect her children. Susan and Tom were placed in protective counseling. Federal Victim Services specialists helped them process the revelation. Their names were changed through sealed court orders, new identities to escape the media attention focused on the Soviet spy's family. The trial began April 14, 1986. Federal courthouse in Alexandria, maximum security. Prosecutors presented 127 pieces of evidence over 3 weeks. The Moscow photograph, decoded messages, testimony from CIA analysts about the damage caused, expert witnesses on Soviet intelligence methodology. David's defense was thin. Moss argued his client had transmitted only low-level information, nothing that genuinely compromised national security. He suggested David had been coerced, manipulated, trapped by circumstances beyond his control. The jury deliberated 73 hours. They returned on May 8th with verdicts on all counts. Guilty. 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 Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. The judge acknowledged David's lack of violence, his cooperation during arrest. But espionage demanded consequences. 40 years in federal prison, eligible for parole after 25. David stood as the sentence was read. His face showed nothing. Inside, something broke that would never properly heal. Margaret attended sentencing but sat in the back row. She left before the session ended. David caught one glimpse of her, older somehow, hollowed out by betrayal. She didn't look at him. His children didn't come. Their new identities meant severing all contact with their father. It was better this way, social workers explained. A clean break allowed healing. David was processed into the federal system on May 23, 1986. Fingerprints, photographs, medical examination, property inventory. He became prisoner 04857-112, stripped of name and identity for the second time in his life. The prison bus rolled toward Marion, Illinois. Through reinforced windows, David watched America pass by. Highways, farmland, small towns, a country he had betrayed, but somehow grown to love. Marion Federal Penitentiary was concrete and steel, designed to break spirits through monotony. David's cell measured 8 by 10 feet. A narrow bed, metal toilet, small desk. The walls were painted institutional beige that absorbed all warmth. Wake-up came at 5:30 a.m. Breakfast at 6 o'clock. Recreation yard at 10 o'clock. Lunch at noon. Count at 3 o'clock. Dinner at 5 o'clock. Lights out at 9 o'clock. The schedule never varied. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. Other inmates knew David was a spy. The guards made sure of it. He was neither attacked nor befriended, simply avoided. Soviet espionage meant nothing to men serving time for bank robbery or drug trafficking. He was strange, foreign, irrelevant to prison hierarchies. David worked in the prison library, shelving books and processing loan requests. The irony wasn't lost on him. Surrounded by English-language texts that had once been his salvation, now his only escape from crushing routine. He wrote letters to Margaret during his first year. Everyone returned unopened. He wrote to Susan and Tom through their attorney. Those letters disappeared into a void, no response ever coming back. In 1992, his attorney informed him that Margaret had remarried. Her new husband was a high school principal in Oregon. She had moved west, started over, built a life that contained no trace of David Walsh or Viktor Fedorov. The Cold War ended outside the prison walls. David learned about it from television news in the common room. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Everything he had sacrificed for ceased to exist. In 1996, prisoner exchange negotiations began. The Russian Federation, eager to demonstrate cooperation with America, offered to take back Soviet-era intelligence operatives. David was on the list, a relic from a conflict that no longer mattered. The exchange was arranged for October 15, 1998. David would be released to Russian custody after 12 years in prison. He was 53 years old, his hair completely gray, his face deeply lined. Processing out felt surreal. They returned his personal effects: a wallet containing expired credit cards, $47, a photograph of his children taken before the arrest. Susan and Tom were forever frozen at ages 13 and 10 in that image. A State Department official briefed him coldly. He was being deported, would never be allowed to return to the United States. Any attempt to contact his former family would result in immediate legal action. The flight to Moscow took 11 hours. David sat in economy class between two Russian diplomatic security officers. Through the window, he watched America disappear beneath clouds. Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport was chaotic, modern, unrecognizable from the Soviet facility he remembered. Advertisements covered every surface, Western brands everywhere. The language sounded familiar but different, slang and phrases that hadn't existed when he left. An FSB officer met him at arrivals. The debriefing was brief and bureaucratic. David would receive a pension of 8,000 rubles monthly, barely enough to survive. An apartment had been arranged in a tower block on Moscow's outskirts. He was home. Except this wasn't home. America wasn't home either. Viktor Fedorov had no home. David Walsh had been a beautiful lie. What remained was a man caught between identities, belonging nowhere, welcomed by no one. The FSB officer handed him keys and directions. No welcome. No gratitude, just processed paperwork and bureaucratic efficiency. David stepped into Moscow's autumn cold, utterly alone. The apartment was on the 14th floor of a concrete tower that looked identical to 50 others in the district. 2 rooms, a kitchenette, a bathroom with perpetually dripping pipes. The previous tenant's furniture remained: a sagging couch, a scarred table, a bed with springs that creaked. Victor, he had to think of himself as Victor now, spent his first weeks simply walking. Moscow had transformed into something alien. McDonald's restaurants occupied prime locations. Billboards advertised Mercedes and Sony. Street vendors sold counterfeit designer goods. The Soviet Union, he remembered, existed only in architectural bones beneath capitalist flesh. His Russian felt stiff, formal, outdated. Decades of speaking English had eroded his native fluency. Young Muscovites used slang he didn't understand, referenced television shows and cultural moments he had missed entirely. He established routines because routines were survival. Morning walks along the Moscow River. Afternoons in Gorky Park feeding pigeons with stale bread. Evenings watching Russian television that felt foreign despite the familiar language. Other pensioners in his building avoided him. Word spread that he was a returned intelligence operative. In the new Russia, Soviet spies weren't heroes. They were embarrassing reminders of a failed system. Nobody wanted association. Victor attempted to locate old training colleagues from the Red Banner Institute. Most were dead. 2 had emigrated. 1 agreed to meet for tea, but the conversation was stilted, awkward, full of uncomfortable silences. They had nothing in common except a past neither wanted to discuss. In 2003, Victor decided to write to his children. He composed the letter carefully, explaining his choices without excusing them. He acknowledged the pain he caused. He asked for nothing except that they know he had loved them genuinely, despite everything. The letter took 3 weeks to write. He revised it endlessly, trying to find words that could bridge 15 years of silence and betrayal. He mailed it to their last known address through Margaret's attorney. It returned 6 weeks later. Return to sender. Addressee unknown. They had disappeared completely, buried their connection to him so thoroughly that even legal channels couldn't reach them. The finality was absolute. Victor kept the returned letter in his desk drawer. Sometimes he reread it, though doing so accomplished nothing. Years passed with increasing emptiness. His pension barely covered basic necessities. He took occasional translation work, but his American English was outdated, filled with idioms from the 1970s and 1980s. Younger translators were faster, cheaper, better connected. Health declined slowly. Arthritis in his hands. High blood pressure controlled poorly by inconsistent medication. A persistent cough that doctors attributed to Moscow's air quality. In 2008, he saw American tourists near Red Square. A family, mother, father, 2 teenage children. The father wore a baseball cap and took photographs. The mother consulted a guidebook. The teenagers complained about walking. Victor watched them from a bench, fighting the urge to approach and speak English. They represented everything he had lost: the ordinary American life, the family connections, the normalcy he had destroyed. The father noticed him staring and moved his family away quickly, protective instinct triggered by an old man's intense gaze. Victor understood. He was frightening now, a ghost haunting his own life. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in October, covering Moscow in white that quickly turned to gray slush. Victor walked less, stayed inside more, felt the apartment walls closing in. On February 3, 2009, he woke with crushing chest pain. He managed to call emergency services before losing consciousness. The ambulance arrived 17 minutes later. Paramedics found Victor unconscious on his kitchen floor, the phone still clutched in his hand. His pulse was weak and irregular. They administered emergency treatment and rushed him to hospital number 15. Doctors diagnosed a massive myocardial infarction. The damage was extensive. Victor regained consciousness briefly in the emergency room, long enough to provide his name and date of birth. No family to contact. No emergency contacts listed anywhere. He survived 3 days in intensive care. Monitors beeped steadily, measuring a heart that had carried too many secrets for too long. Nurses rotated through shifts, efficient and professional, with a patient who had no visitors. On February 6, 2009, at 4:23 a.m., Viktor Fedorov's heart stopped. Resuscitation attempts failed. Time of death was recorded with bureaucratic precision in medical charts that would be filed and forgotten. The hospital contacted the FSB because Victor's records flagged him as a former intelligence operative. An administrator arranged a minimal funeral. Cremation, no service, ashes interred in a municipal columbarium outside Moscow. His obituary appeared in Moskovsky Komsomolets on February 10th. 3 sentences. Viktor Fedorov, 66, died February 6th from heart failure, former state employee, survived by no immediate family. Nobody attended the cremation except the funeral home staff. His apartment was cleared by building management. Personal effects, clothes, books, a few photographs, were disposed of. The returned letter to his children was thrown away with everything else. Margaret learned of Victor's death through a State Department notification in March 2009. She was 62, living in Portland with her second husband. The news arrived as a formal letter confirming the death of a foreign national with previous connections to her family. She read the letter once, placed it in a file cabinet, and never mentioned it to anyone. Her second husband knew about her first marriage only in vague terms, a mistake from long ago, best forgotten. Susan had become a corporate attorney in Seattle. Tom taught high school history in Sacramento. Both had families, children of their own, successful lives built on foundations that deliberately excluded their father. They were never informed of Victor's death. Their mother saw no reason to resurrect old pain. Robert Chen, the CIA analyst who discovered the photograph in 1985, retired in 2007. He lived in suburban Virginia, occasionally giving lectures on Cold War intelligence operations. The Viktor Fedorov case was a footnote in his career, successful but not spectacular. Special Agent Laura Martinez retired in 2001 after 26 years with the FBI. She remembered Operation Silent Grove as one of her most significant cases. At retirement parties, colleagues sometimes asked about the Soviet spy she caught. Martinez described the arrest with practiced efficiency, always ending the same way. He chose wrong and paid for it. The intelligence Viktor transmitted to Moscow between 1972 and 1985 was ultimately assessed as moderately valuable. Useful for understanding American diplomatic operations, but not strategically decisive. After the Soviet Union's collapse, much of what he reported became historically irrelevant. His story became a training case study at both CIA and FBI academies, an example of long-term penetration, successful counterintelligence work, and the human cost of espionage. The Cold War produced thousands like Viktor. Men and women who traded everything for ideology, who lived lies so complete they forgot truth, who sacrificed families for causes that eventually crumbled.